Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us as we wrap up Restorative Justice Month with this timely discussion on restorative justice legislation and its potential to advance restorative approaches to community healing and accountability. We're grateful for all of the attendees' presence today and excited to hear from our panelists. My name is Avery Arrington. I use she and her pronouns, and I serve as an assistant director for the National Center on Restorative Justice. And before I turn things over to our moderator, I just want to acknowledge and thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, our host institution, Vermont Law and Graduate School, and our collaborative grant partners at the University of San Diego and the University of Vermont for their continued dedication and investment in this work. I'll now turn things over to Talia Gonzalez, a law professor, research chair, and faculty co-director of the Center for Racial and Economic Justice at UC Law San Francisco, formerly known as UC Hastings. Talia has been professionally engaged in the field of restorative justice for more than 20 years. So we appreciate you, Talia, for taking the time to moderate today's conversation.
First, Avery, thank you so much for having me. And I'll say also, perhaps on behalf of our panelists, I think they also appreciate being here and really being able to dig in a little bit. I wanted to welcome everybody. It's exciting that we have such a diversity of representation across the country and the systems in which people work, within the specific workplaces in which they're engaged. And so with that, kind of come back to what the learning objectives were, to hope, right, that we can all meet those in some small form or fashion. So, today I think part of the aim is that, each of the esteemed panelists as experts in the work that they're doing in Oregon and Colorado at a national level and Minnesota, right, that there's the opportunity to kind of think about restorative justice legislation as it exists across jurisdictions. And so we'll think about that temporally, sort of in that evolution of when things were before legislation and perhaps where they are now, both teasing out similarities and differences. I think to the extent that we can really focus this on how restorative justice is integrative into the criminal legal context and at multiple points along that continuum or outside of it, our panelists will attend to that. And then lastly, it's both the benefit and the burden, right? And that there are both sides of that coin when we're talking about legislation. And so that also is an aim for all of us today. I will already foreshadow that none of our panelists are going to answer necessarily specifics about all kinds of laws across the country. So to the extent if you want to look up where there is legislation in your given jurisdiction or start to make comparisons, there is a free searchable legislative database that the National Center on Restorative Justice has put together. And one of our panelists, Dr. Shannon Sleva, and myself worked on that. And so we're delighted that people have strong interest. And if you want to look that up, please do use that. There's also a companion resource that the National Center on Restorative Justice and the National Association of Community Restorative Justice has created that's about programs and practitioners, right? So from a programmatic standpoint, those are also free resources just to kind of help hone in on our conversation. I'm going to open with some initial questions that will go to everyone in the group, and we'll pass those around. And then I might be more targeted and kind of calling on specific folks for doing that. And I want to say thank you that both of those resources have now been put in the chat for everyone, both in terms of the law database and then also the map. So, again, if we're starting from a temporal standpoint, in that there is a predating to legislation, and depending on your jurisdiction, that might be earlier than others. I'd love to hear from each of you to talk about sort of why, right? Why was legislation something that was of interest, whether it be in Oregon or Colorado, or, Erica, I know you work in multiple places, or Representative Weiss in Minnesota. So kind of help us understand the context. So maybe that's because there were resources there. Maybe you'll draw us to some political. And in that, because we're not doing formal introductions, if you could kind of cite yourself in that work, that would be really wonderful. So I'm actually going to start with you, Tristan, and then I'll ask you to pass it to the next person. I cannot hear you, Tristan. I'm not sure if others can.
Is this any better? Okay, yeah, my computer just does that sometimes. I'm working on that with IT. Every time I call them, it fixes itself. But anyways, Outside of having tech issues, I am also a public defender in Portland, Oregon. And I guess my involvement in legislative work also kind of dovetailed with my involvement in restorative justice work, and has led me to go from being kind of your classic line public defender to having a mixed position where I represent folks who are charged with major felony cases, and I also work on policy issues related to promoting the use of restorative justice as an alternative to prosecution. And I first got involved with the restorative justice side of things in 2020. In terms of kind of political openings for this kind of work, I think folks probably remember that 2020 was a very impactful year in the realm of criminal justice reform with the protests that happened in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And there were very active protests in Oregon and in Portland specifically, which motivated the governor to create which she called a racial justice council. And she invited leaders from across the state of Oregon with diverse backgrounds to kind of work on specific subject areas. And so I had the opportunity to work on the committee that was related to criminal justice reform. And I had long been interested in restorative justice and its ability to be an alternative to prosecution, not something that is adjacent to the criminal system, not necessarily even, a standard diversion program from the criminal system, but something that could be tested as a true alternative. So I called up an expert in restorative justice who is on this panel, Erica Washington, and I asked her, I said, I have this opportunity to propose legislation through the governor's office. What can the state do for restorative justice? And we had a good conversation about what it means to pass meaningful legislation and what some of the barriers are and what some of the opportunities are. And what it really came down to was the need to fund restorative justice programs. So initially, that first step of doing legislative work around restorative justice really was focused on funding. And since that point, it has been largely focused on funding. We went and we worked on confidentiality legislation in 2023. But outside of that one policy bill, most of the effort, all of the efforts in the state of Oregon have been to maintain funding for the program so that we can really, root this movement, seed this movement, demonstrate success, and kind of work towards other legislative goals once we've built up those resources. So that's how it started here.
Great, thank you so much. Well, since you invoked Erica in your response, I'm going to pass it to her next then.
I am so excited to hear from everyone on this panel. And Tristan, what a beautiful way to open our time up and our space up. And thanks so much for inviting me to participate to the National Center. So in terms of kind of how we found ourselves here in doing legislative advocacy work, really, and I think largely this is the case probably for all of us, but restorative justice legislation was absolutely not really an interest for us at all. The interest was really addressing the challenges that we were having from a decade of trying to build programs. And so our purpose was, how do we build programs and create the opportunity for restorative justice to be the response to harm, recognizing that the response of the criminal legal system is criminogenic, it causes more harm. I am a recovering attorney who worked in the criminal legal system, walked into courts day in and day out, and never really experienced or witnessed healing post-harm. And so, so from our real kind of challenge to build and seed this work across the country, came the recognition that some of the challenges we are facing, some of the barriers to actually seeding the work, really creating the opportunity for folks across the country, were in fact policy and legislative barriers. And so my work specifically, I'm with an organization called Equal Justice USA on the Restorative Justice Project there. The project has existed for now about a decade. We previously were at an organization called Impact Justice, but in that decade, we have partnered with many communities across the country to build programs that are reflective of that local context, but are really rooted in kind of 8 core principles is what we call it. And I name that because it wasn't that we couldn't build restorative programs if we were willing to contort and shift and just do what the legislative frameworks in those states allowed for. We probably could have built something, but we weren't able to necessarily build restorative justice aversion programs that we felt were rooted in the principles that we believe this work needs to be rooted in, when we are risking so much by putting it in such intimate relationship with the criminal legal system, the system that we are not looking to mimic as much as humanly possible. And so, yeah, for us, some of those, and I'm not going to read out all of them, I want to make sure there's space for everyone, but some of those kind of model elements that we struggled to design programs in alignment with because of legislative or policy barriers included, building out pre-charge diversion opportunities, right? So front end, ideally pre-charge diversion. We know 19 states have limits on when restorative justice can occur. We wanted to build programs that were structured to avoid net widening of the legal system, right? So not cases that ultimately weren't going to be prosecuted in the first place. We have a problem with mass incarceration in this country. We wanted these programs to center the needs of survivors, but also to address mass incarceration and the creation of additional harmed folks and additional survivors. And so we would run into realities whereby, 15 states in this country restrict eligibility of restorative justice. And some of that meant only quite low-level cases were eligible for diversion. And then, of course, we are committed to protecting confidentiality. And we all know that without some, legislative framework around that, we're really reliant on kind of individual law enforcement agencies agreeing that they won't utilize information that they may gain as a result of restorative justice in a court of law to prosecute an individual, etc. We needed to fund the work. We were struggling. So we really got into legislative advocacy because we wanted to build principled restorative justice programming, and we ran into legislative challenges in our attempts to do that. And I'll stop there. And I can pass to you, Representative Feist.
Well, thank you. Very excited to be here with all of you. Very honored to be invited to participate on this panel. So I am an immigration attorney in my day job, but in 2020, I decided that the world felt like a pretty bleak place, and I wanted to do something that was tangible, that was good for my community, to feel more empowered. And so I ran for office. There was a retirement and an opening, and it felt like the universe was telling me to do that. So I've been in the Minnesota House of Representatives since then. I was just reelected for what will be my third term. And initially when I went in, I just wanted to like advance justice, whatever that looked like. I wasn't sure. I knew I cared a lot about children and about our legal systems. And immediately I was asked by a colleague to take on the role as the chief author of a bill called the Veterans Restorative Justice Act, which I'd heard of as a layperson, and it just kept not passing. It was like this bipartisan bill that everybody loved, but for some reason it kept dying. And my colleague told me it was because it had lawyer issues, and could I please just take it from him and deal with the lawyer issues? And so I did. And it was interesting. It was a very prescriptive bill. So it did have those limits on eligibility based on the severity of the crime. But what it did was it created a uniform system across the state of Minnesota, regardless of whether there happened to be a veterans treatment court, where if there was a nexus between the criminal act and a service-related trauma or injury, then the veteran was able to choose a restorative path. And if they successfully went through that restorative process, then the charges against them would be completely dismissed, and they can move on with their lives. And so we got it passed my first session, and that just got me really passionate about restorative justice, which until that point, was words to me. I didn't really have a concrete understanding of it as a concept or a process. And I, at the same time, was a member of this bipartisan, bicameral public safety working group. And we would meet every Monday, way too early, and we would just have guests come and speak to us about different topics of, bipartisan interest. And a number of experts came and spoke to us about kids. And so I was like, oh, there's such a bipartisan passion around addressing issues around youth justice. And obviously, like, we come at it from different angles across party lines, but there was like this real interest. And at that point, we were a divided legislature and had been for a decade. And so I was like, this is a space that is bipartisan, that I think that we can really do something and it would have a really big impact. And so I thought to myself, I'll just put the Veterans Restorative Justice Act on kids and then it'll work. And then I realized as I had more and more conversations with experts that kids and veterans are different, different issues, different processes. And so we basically created this working group that kind of snowballed. And for 2 years, we just kept meeting and just more and more people came. And so it was, youth justice experts, public defenders, child welfare, law enforcement. Like, it was just this big group of people passionate about kids and lots of experts in restorative practices. And then surprisingly, we ended up with full Democratic control of the whole, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office last term. And so we had this moment. We also happened to have a $17.5 billion surplus. So we had all this money and all this control. And I was like, I'm not ready. Like, this bill is still a concept. Like, I don't know what to do with all of this energy and these ideas. And then a colleague of mine was like, you just go for it. We have all this money and all this power, like, just figure it out. And so we did. And we put together a bill that everyone hated, that was very prescriptive and was like, everyone would have obligations across the state, and all of every stakeholder that you can imagine hated it. They were like, no, don't tell us what to do. And we realized that it was actually a very bad structure because, restorative justice, like, is inherently community-based, and we were doing like this very top-down concept. And so what we ended up with and passed into law is a creation of a statewide Office of Restorative Practices focused on youth, currently within our Department of Public Safety, but it's migrating very soon to our newly created Department of Children, Youth, and Families, because we wanted it to focus on like wellness and families and children, and not on like, how do we stop kids from being bad? Like, we really wanted to center it in the right place. And so not only will they have money, they'll have $8 million this biennium and then $5 million per biennium ongoing, which we fought very hard for. So they'll have the money, but also we're going to have this like office that's funded well enough to staff 4 people that are going to provide technical assistance and resources and a space for people to come together and share experiences, information. So I'm excited about it. We'll be talking about challenges with implementation, just like you create an idea and then you send it off into the world. And I have some thoughts about that too, but I'm excited by what we achieved, and I'm looking forward to continuing to legislate in this space. So thank you. And I can pass it to Shannon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Sleva. I am not a lawyer or a retiring lawyer or a recovering lawyer. I am a professor in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. And I came to this work through research and the beginnings of my career as a social scientist, which I can't believe was now over a decade ago. I was really just learning about restorative justice, getting immersed in the practice of it and exploring it from an academic standpoint as sort of this, as an alternative response to harm in communities. So how can we do justice more or better, or actually do justice? And I think at that time, legislation seemed to me like the most obvious pathway to expand and scale access to restorative solutions in the criminal legal system. I'm not sure I actually think that anymore, and I don't know if I'll be the grumpy one on this panel or if others will join me in that. I think at this point, I'm thinking a lot more about questions around when legislation is valuable to us in creating the kind of restorative world that we might be dreaming of, and when it's not useful or a waste of some of our resources that we might be using toward other efforts. at the time that I started my work, I was in Texas, and I wanted to understand what was predicting the adoption of restorative justice legislation that was kind of picking up across the country. So I was gathering information on the state level statutes in each state, and then looking at a number of variables through quantitative modeling to see what predicted the adoption of legislation. The most predictive thing that I found was actually the percentage of the legislature that was female, which is interesting looking around our panel today and then maybe comparing that to other panels that you might have participated on other kinds of solutions in the criminal legal system. That we can see that there's something about the way that women carry this this role in this peacemaking work. Beyond that, I also did some in-depth work in Texas and in Colorado, trying to really understand the qualities and the process of what was happening in the legislative process around restorative justice. And so I spent days and hours and weeks like listening to all the legislative hearings that had taken place in each state around restorative justice bills that had come up for consideration in that time period in kind of the early 2000s. And I guess one thing that I can say is that just like as holding those two states as examples, what stuck out to me was how different sort of the processes were. That when we're thinking about, well, why did restorative justice come to the surface in your particular state? I can say that probably there's different reasons and different interests in different states. In Texas, the restorative justice bills that had been adopted were really centered around this idea of victims' rights and the right of the victim to be able to have kind of a confrontation or an interaction with the person who had harmed them. And in Colorado, it was really an outlet of this really rich community of restorative justice practice and viewed primarily as kind of a progressive alternative within the legal system, which I think still characterizes it. So it's actually like what motivated my journey to Colorado was the chance to be immersed in the really rich environment that still is here of people doing practice, doing organizing, meeting at local levels and at state levels to talk about restorative justice and how it might unfold and what are the best ways to move it forward and in what context. And yeah, it's a really exciting community to be a part of. So I hope I can share a little bit from that standpoint in terms of being a part of that community in Colorado, as well as just from a broader standpoint of trying to understand restorative justice legislation, its implementation, and its impacts over the years.
I really appreciate those opening and entry points because we're hearing both about the political opportunity structures that might have existed in your state. I don't know what it's like to be in a state that just is sitting in a surplus of money all the time. So maybe I'll be moving to Minnesota, Representative Weiss, because that's not our problem in California. It's to just be rolling in excess dollars and thinking about what that looks like. But I want to kind of where Shannon left off, I want to push a little bit on stakeholders because political opportunity structures could be because there's an interest in advancing victims' rights to thinking about the point of Texas, or funding, thinking about Oregon, or thinking about reduction of harm for populations, right? First veterans and now for young people. In Minnesota, or because in Colorado, there's a really sort of strong, to use your language, right, sort of progressive community context. But who then are those stakeholders, right? Because legislation doesn't happen in isolation of people, even if you have strong representatives that carry it forward. And so kind of picking up on Shannon's last point of like, who were those stakeholders and how did that sort of come together, coalesce, you know, certainly to the extent that if there's working groups internally on a government side, that's really beneficial. That might be bringing in something that's more bi-directional, but to kind of help people answer the question of like, oh, I've got a political context that might be viable. who needs to be sitting at the table, right? Who do I ensure is sort of part and parcel of those activities as stakeholders, even though that's an imperfect word in that context. And so maybe I'll start with you, Shannon, then let you just pass it to whomever next in that context, but kind of help people kind of tease that out a little bit. And yes, we will let you be not grumpy, but raise the fact that there are realities relative to the benefits and burdens, very significant burdens of legislation, and whether it is actually serving an appropriate purpose as always positioned, right? The law is not benevolent, and it's also not self-effectuating. So.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I think that the question of stakeholders is probably a question of core importance in my view. One of the things that stuck out in the following of these legislative processes has been just the role of different interest groups, whether it's either in a positive direction or in a pushback. I would say one thing that sticks out to me is kind of a paradoxical or ambivalent relationship of the victim advocacy community or victim services community with restorative justice, which many people in this call are probably familiar with. So in Colorado in particular, there was a state victim advocacy organization that was really involved in pushing back on some of the restorative justice legislation in Colorado and negotiating for their concerns to be incorporated in terms of how restorative practices could be initiated and by whom, and sort of what the interaction would be with victims who are in the criminal legal system related to the extension of restorative practices. So a lot of fear around the possibility that victims might be taken advantage of, or have a restorative process forced on them, or be re-traumatized by restorative justice. At the same time, probably one of the more influential interests was victims who were very outspoken on different pieces of legislation about wanting that access and seeking it. So there was a really high profile case here in Colorado around that time, a woman named Charlotta Evans, who is still a really vocal part of the restorative justice community here, whose son had been killed in a drive-by shooting at the age of 3. And this was 20 years after the fact, and she was desperately seeking a victim offender dialogue with the person who was responsible for her son's death. And at that time, we didn't have legal access for her to get that through the Department of Corrections where that person was being held. And so Charlotta's testimony was really important for the legislature. I'll also just mention that another really important group to negotiate with here in Colorado was the District Attorneys Association. I wrote down earlier, I think it was Representative Bites, who said something about, no, don't tell us what to do. And that made me think of the District Attorneys Associations in both states who were like, we really don't want to be restricted in our discretion. And so there were negotiations, political negotiations in both states with those interest groups that were more successful in Colorado than they were in Texas. I'll leave it at that. I want to see what others have to say to this question. And Representative Feist, maybe I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I'm so interested. I wrote down that the biggest predictor of whether you pass legislation is how many women are in the legislature. Because I was thinking, so it was all women except for one chair, like who were part of the leadership in the policy space that made the decision to like create our office and fund it. So go figure. But yeah, so we have the County Attorneys Association, and they definitely were a big part of the negotiations as well. And they were definitely the ones who were like, don't be prescriptive, don't tell us what to do. In terms of our big advocates, we worked a lot with law enforcement. It was really interesting, actually. One of the police officers who I worked with a lot reached out to Pete Lee in Colorado. Senator Lee was the person who kind of drove a lot of the restorative justice legislation in Colorado. And then Pete Lee was like, you should talk to Sandra in Minnesota, where you are. And so that officer and I created a great connection that continues to this day. And we talk about how to like implement laws that we created and where we want to go next. But law enforcement was a really important voice. And we also worked a lot with counties. 17 counties in Minnesota have some type of restorative justice programming. And so counties in greater Minnesota that have Republican legislators were really great messengers. And, you know, one of the biggest, most longstanding programs in Minnesota is in greater Minnesota. Yellow Medicine County has a restorative justice department that they created in, I think, 2001. And they have so much really great data about how impactful this has been in terms of cost saving and reducing out-of-home placement and reducing recidivism. And so being able to have that voice in the legislature from very conservative districts, part of the state, was really helpful. And so because we had, you know, not just our youth justice and our racial justice advocates, but also like people who sometimes the stakeholders don't agree on reforms, the fact that everyone was coming together and saying this is a really, really good policy, it allowed us to move what I hope will be a pretty radical bill into law with really no pushback. A local newspaper just wrote an article about our new office, and they interviewed the Republican minority lead in our public safety committee, and he said he thought it was all great. And that the only thing is that as a Republican, he's obligated to say he doesn't like, you know, big bureaucracy and, you know, government spending. But in terms of like restorative practices and what we're trying to do, he was very supportive. So I think having those voices, you know, geographically distributed and also just coming from different perspectives coming together can really help bridge divides and get like a really broad group of legislators to be very supportive. Should I pass it to somebody or should I let
Be great.
Talia tell us where to go next?
Erica, Tristan, does one of you want to weigh in? Question really is open to everyone. I'd love to hear responses about stakeholders.
Okay, do you want to go, Tristan, and I can, or I'll go. Okay, I'll check. Yeah.
Take it up.
Yeah, I'll pass to you after. Yeah, you know, for us, you know, so I started by introducing, right, like this effort to build programming and create opportunities and challenges that we ran into. And so really for us, and the piece of legislation that I'll probably speak to the most throughout this conversation is AB 60 out of California, which essentially created a statutory right that survivors have to be notified of restorative justice opportunities that exist in their jurisdiction. So law enforcement have to notify them of that, you know, DA staff, et cetera, community staff, et cetera. And so, yeah, for us, we essentially partnered with some community-based organizations that operate restorative justice programming throughout the state of California to construct and facilitate listening sessions across the state that invited many organizations that are doing restorative justice, both in rural communities, more Republican-leaning, conservative communities, more progressive communities, and really invited all of these practitioners into a pretty substantial series of listening sessions that really explored what are the barriers that each of them as practitioners on the ground are actually facing in their efforts to do restorative justice work. And a lot came out of that. So much came out of that. One of the major things that came out of that was not just like a mapping of what those challenges are, but also a real kind of activation that we were able to capitalize on to create what's called the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition, which is a collection of specifically practitioners. But I will name, and I can certainly say this for the programs throughout California that we've partnered with. That's a program in LA, a couple in the Bay Area, in Richmond County, et cetera. Those are programs where many of the practitioners themselves are survivors of pretty significant harm, themselves have committed harm and potentially have been system impacted as a result of the commission of harm or the experience of harm. Many have gone through restorative justice processes. And so I say that because a big stakeholder ultimately for passing that survivor's right or victim's right to notification of restorative justice opportunities was the fact that just within the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition, we were able to speak not just as practitioners, but as survivors and as folks who have caused harm, many of which, of course, that lives in one body so often, and folks who've gone through RJ processes and facilitated RJ processes. So for us, it was really important to actually build out practitioner power and make ourselves known in the Capitol. I mean, one of the realities about, getting AB 60 passed was that another stakeholder that existed in California and really in this effort to pass that legislation, as was named already, were law enforcement. We had the District Attorneys Association in California. Judges were getting involved in restorative justice legislation. And what we were seeing was that folks in the Capitol were reaching out to them. And that made sense because a lot of them are the folks who have been the traditional power brokers on issues that have affected the criminal legal system, right? And so it was really critical, and really what we did with AB 60 was really look to kind of become a recognized body of folks that are experts in this, should be reached out to, should be the ones asked about what this practice is, what it entails, and really honestly trying to disrupt, I think, what is just a kind of path that has been tread so often, whereby an issue such as restorative justice does kind of sometimes consciously or unconsciously really prioritize the voice of law enforcement. And so that was really an intentional move from us, and it has been quite successful. We have seen that it's our voice that is really being elicited for additional legislative opportunities that are being explored in California. And the last thing I'll just say is, we did have a legislature that was, they had a select committee on restorative justice that was operating. We ultimately had like a main author who introduced the bill, Assemblymember Bryan, who, was very passionate about restorative justice, really came to the legislature with much of his career in criminal justice, legal reform work. And so, yeah, we had listening ears inside, and we were able to kind of bring practitioners that could kind of speak from multiple perspectives and really make themselves known in the Capitol and ultimately get that bill across the finish line. And I'll pass to you, Tristan.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear from everyone and see kind of like what bits and pieces really relate to kind of the experience that I've had working on this issue in Oregon. As I mentioned, so the first bill that was passed to kind of, at least since I've been working on these issues to kind of support restorative justice programming, was a bill that created what's called the Restorative Justice Grant Program. It is a dedicated fund for restorative justice programs that operate as alternatives to prosecution. And I mentioned that bill came through the Governor's Racial Justice Council. And I will say that the passage of that bill happened at the same time that there was a lot of effort to kind of pass these huge criminal justice reform bills. There was this really big omnibus bill to attack a lot of different issues. And frankly, the legislature was not willing to go as far as a lot of the advocates wanted in terms of ending things like mandatory minimums or restricting consent searches. And so the Restorative Justice Grant Program in many ways was passed as a part of kind of a political compromise, and looking at all these different bills that different advocates within the criminal justice reform space wanted and deciding which ones the legislature would agree to. I didn't have a strong role in that process at the time. I was sitting on the committee. They would, call me to provide testimony when needed. But my primary focus and my practice was working on my criminal defense cases. When the bill passed, I was lucky to get some opportunities through county grants to be able to focus more specifically on how do we build out this grant program to make sure that it's effectuating the intent that was prescribed by the legislature. And that led to the creation of, or the investment in many different restorative justice programs across the state. And kind of at the same time that I was working on, advancing that legislation to the degree that I was involved, I also joined a very important organization in Oregon called the Restorative Justice Coalition of Oregon, which is a convening body for different practitioners across the state. And so in partnership with RJCO, really worked on developing the rules for how this fund would be administered, what the eligibility criteria would be, what restrictions there would be, where we didn't want to see any restrictions, and then getting the word out. And so that we had folks that were applying to this grant and working to build up these new programs. In Oregon, a lot of the programs are run through mediation or dispute resolution centers, which have become organizations that are really at the forefront of the restorative justice movement here. So when we went back to the legislature in 2023 to try and pass confidentiality legislation, which we were successful in doing, and to get renewed funding for the grant, we were building kind of from scratch. We were working to educate legislators on this topic that most of them were very unfamiliar with. And so in terms of the stakeholders that were involved in that, it's kind of largely in alignment with what Erica was saying. It was folks who were working in restorative justice, who are practitioners, who are trying to develop programs. There was a lot of overlap as well with people who were survivors of harm, people who had previously been responsible parties, and folks who were both. And so we really used those people to help kind of explain what restorative justice is and to really preach the good word of why we need to continue this funding, why confidentiality was so important. At the same time, we were super green. This was the first time that RJCO had ever stepped into the legislative space. I wasn't even registered as a lobbyist at the time. We had a lobbyist from Multnomah County who was kind of holding our hand and like telling us when we needed to meet different deadlines and how we needed to get different legislators engaged and when. And so I think we did a pretty good job given the fact that we were so new, and we were successful in getting confidentiality passed. There was a process. We had a legislator submit our bill. We had hearings. We testified at hearings. And then at the end of session, we were told that though confidentiality had passed with the intent of protecting these programs that had just started building up, the legislature had not given us any funding to actually continue those programs. And that is when I learned that not everything that the legislature decides is totally coherent and makes sense. And that when you get a policy bill passed, there's a very clear structure and process for that. But advancing a budget issue is really different. And a lot of those conversations around budget issues happen behind closed doors and frankly require a lot more connections within the legislature. And so we learned a lot. And in 2024, actually, I guess we started working for the 2024 session in 2023 in like August, just building those relationships and really meeting with people and bringing in programs to educate legislatures on what programs exist in their area. And we were successful in getting the funding back basically in the nick of time to save all of these programs in the middle of 2024. And now we're gearing up for a third session, and I think that we're stronger because of the work that we've done before, and are trying to broaden our engagement in terms of stakeholders to community-based organizations, engaging more with law enforcement, district attorneys, with different parts of the court system, and really just continuing to try and build that body, that group of people who are willing to participate in helping us push this forward.
Thank you. So all of you have attended to either implicitly or explicitly questions about implementation post-legislation. And I want to acknowledge that because I'm going to ask that question, but I'm not asking that question yet. Why? Because each of you has also talked about when legislation is passed, and there starts and stumbles, and not everywhere legislation passed. And so if you have worked in this space legislatively in different states where you've had the experience with it not passing, right? Not to the point of policy versus budget and feeling the inadequacies of the legislative process, But where it actually hasn't moved forward, I invite then some reflections on why you think, what was that legislation? Why do you think it didn't move forward? And did it ultimately in subsequent cycles move forward? Because before we move to thinking about in this world of legislation has existed and then on an implementation side. So I open this up to anyone sort of depending on the spaces in which they've worked in. I don't know if that makes the most sense, right, for Erica and Shannon. I don't want to exclude Tristan and Representative Weiss, but thinking about what I know about each of you and your portfolios and the work you do. So I leave it to the two of you to maybe start us off with and go from there.
Yeah, I can get us started, and it won't be, I don't have a ton to say, unfortunately, but yeah, definitely have the experience of being unsuccessful. And for us, we moved from a very exciting win with respect to AB 60, though, as was just named, that Talia said, ultimately a win just means now it's time for implementation, and that's really where the work begins. But we moved from there, and this again was based on those kind of in-depth listening sessions. We had folks really name confidentiality, of which we don't have legislation to support, confidentiality or admissibility, what we ultimately ended up calling the Integrity Act for California, that was supposed to really protect information shared in a restorative justice process, right, would be inadmissible in any future legal proceedings. And that was going to be AB 2833. And unfortunately, we put that legislation forward and really ran into a lot of resistance. We ran into a lot of requests for exceptions to that confidentiality, or the privilege legislation, inadmissibility legislation. At some, kind of arguments from legislators that at some point that harm, conversations about that harm almost shouldn't be protected because of the significance of that harm. And so we were really asked to make a lot of amendments, and we would take every amendment back to the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition and really sit with it and play it out, and how it would ultimately impact not just the folks participating in a process, but what it would look like for facilitators to have to sit and explain, oh, if you say this, it's not protected. If you say that, it is protected. And just almost like putting them in a role of really trying to interpret legislation and convey kind of where the protection stopped and began to participants. And so ultimately we parked that bill. We decided that we weren't willing to make the amendments that we were being basically told were the only way that we were going to be able to pass that legislation. And for us, we really felt like that was that the amendments being called for were a result of just a lack of education, just like a deep lack of understanding within the Capitol, within the legislator, about what restorative justice is and its benefits, and why truth-telling and really protecting truth-telling is so quintessential to its success. And we had to slow down. We had to really slow down, and we needed to focus on education and not moving policy. And that's actually what we're focused on for the first half of next year, and what we've been focused on for the last number of months. And that, with implementation of AB 60 is truly tapping our capacity. So I do think it's an appropriate movement forward, but it's always disappointing, when you push something that you're passionate about and ultimately have to step away from it. So yeah, I will pass to Shannon.
Yeah, I think something that's sticking out to me across everything that folks have shared is just the importance of the process in terms of the policy adoption being mirroring restorative process, or being collaborative rather than adversarial. That was something that stuck out to me in terms of my kind of comparative case study between Texas and Colorado, that even though Texas had some restorative justice legislation, during the time period that I was studying, my interest was in the contrast that bills were going up in Texas each cycle, but were not being passed, whereas in Colorado they were. And I think, a few things that I noticed about the differences between the cases were, first, that sort of collaborative process, which in Colorado, as I mentioned earlier, was really enriched by this grassroots network of practitioners who were invested, who were demonstrating the practices, who were connecting with legislators and system stakeholders in their local communities about their practice, and who were showing up for legislative hearings. In Texas, the efforts were primarily driven by the Institute for Restorative Justice and Restorative Dialogue at UT Austin and some other, sort of organized groups, but not that like broad-based support, lacked that. I think one indicator of sort of the richness of what was happening, or how even the process was unfolding each date in terms of engagement, was that the legislative hearings that I listened to in Texas were on average less than 20 minutes. And the Colorado hearings on restorative justice bills would be like over 2 hours, some of them 4 hours, with people coming in to testify and really talk about that. I also think that one thing that can't be understated is sort of the role of key champions in this work. And I think that can be a good thing and a bad thing. In Colorado, we've had Representative Lee and then Senator Lee, who was the champion for most of these pieces of legislation that passed between 2007 and all the way up until he left office in just the last couple of years. And his commitment to restorative justice as like his core issue put it helped facilitate that engagement, because that's a lot of labor and I'm sure that's something that Representative Feist can speak to, is like the labor that goes into really like pouring effort into an issue to do the engagement of the community, negotiation with different groups who may have different interests, and his ability to really work across the aisle and to make concessions that were acceptable to the restorative practices community, but that also made the bills palatable for other groups. I think the downside of that is that then, in the absence of that person, then sometimes the implementation of the project, if it didn't really represent a collaborative effort, can fall flat. So I think one thing that sticks out is the importance of the collaborative process. And I know this is where Talia is going, not only for passing the legislation, but for seeing the policy actually be actionable. If it wasn't collaborative prior, then it's really not likely to move forward in a meaningful way. It'll just be another law that exists that we don't quite know what to do with, because folks weren't engaged in making it, seeing it put into practice.
Thanks, Shannon, and Erica. So I don't know if Representative Feist or Tristan, you want to weigh in on the failure, or when it hasn't moved forward, or if not, we can pivot to thinking about the messiness, right, of implementation, as each of you has already leaned into a couple times. But I just want to make sure there isn't addendums you'd like to add in that sort of context. Okay. Great. So really, I have foreshadowed this question enough, right? You all want to talk about it. Shannon wants to be grumpy. I don't know exactly what that means, but to the extent that's her language, not mine. Legislation is passed. It's not self-actualizing, right? It's not perfect. Each of you have alluded to that. So I'd really like to think about both to diagnostically, like what is going on in this implementation place, and then where and how people have tried to really then see implementation occur, right? Because it's one thing to sort of think about the problem. It's another thing to then act in a more solutionary, radical way. And so I invite sort of answers in that context. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, whoever wants to unmute first, because I know all of you want to talk about this topic. Oh, I have a hand up, not even an unmuting. I've got a hand. So please, Representative Feist.
Great. Thanks. So I definitely agree with Shannon about how the collaborative development process is so critical. Like I said, I had this working group that just like grew and grew, and it ebbed and it flowed, and we kept meeting for years, and then we created legislation. And so, we passed our bill, and then immediately I was like, okay, Department of Public Safety, hire somebody. Let's go. We have a ton of money. And I followed up with them basically like every other week for like a year and a half. And they kept giving me new answers. Like, it'll be by July, it'll be by this autumn, it'll be by this winter, it'll definitely be by the time the legislative session starts, it'll be by March. And it just like kept getting pushed back. But in the meantime, the community that worked on this legislation was doing presentations and, PowerPoints, and making sure people knew kind of what was coming and what to expect, and making sure that we didn't forget about it. I had to pass an extra law to save $4 million for my bill, because otherwise it would have just been lost to the general fund because the Department of Public Safety took too long. So like, if I hadn't been paying attention, we would have just lost $4 million that was meant to go for restorative practices for kids, and I would have been very angry. But it's been pretty rocky, I would say. We finally got a new director, which was great. And they were definitely involved in the process, and they were one of our big advocates, which was great. But there are, as you all know, there's just a lot of ways to come to restorative practices. There are a lot of communities that bring like their own perspectives and priorities and values to restorative practices, and not everybody sees what we're trying to do exactly the same way. And so we have all this money that we have to spend really fast, which we shouldn't have had to spend really fast. They should have just hired somebody right away. But that urgency has just created a lot of challenges, like hearing about Tristan's like process of creating those like thoughtful grant guidelines so that we can ensure that it's like an equitable distribution and consideration process, and that we're strategically dedicating those funds where we want them to go to have the biggest impact. That all is happening on a condensed timeline that's created just a lot of tension and confusion and frustration. It is my hope that because we tied so much money to this office, they're in the process of hiring additional team members. We should have 4 members of this office ultimately, one whose only job is to help with this grant process, full-time, 40 hours a week, which will be really helpful. But I think it's also really important to get more community voices into the office, so that they can be expressing some of the concerns with like, how are we making sure that these grants are accessible to every type of organization and program. So yeah, my hope ultimately is just that we have a really bumpy first round of grants. And then a lot, like, because there was so much money involved, everybody's very motivated to figure it out. And so my hope is just a year from now, a lot of that groundwork has been laid. A lot of those kind of harder conversations between people who have different perspectives have been had, and we're all kind of on the same page in a more effective way. But yeah, it's been a bit frustrating, but I remain optimistic that because of the way we structured it, and because like Shannon was saying, like so many people had a hand in how we wrote this legislation, that ultimately like it will get launched, and it'll move from public safety to children, youth, and families. And I think that will be helpful as well.
Oh, don't all jump in at once.
I pick it up where Rep. Feist left off. So I've talked a little bit about implementation in terms of just like when the fund initially was passed, and just kind of like spreading the word and giving information to folks about what it means to create a restorative justice program, and that, we finally had this availability of funds for different centers to be able to do that. And I want to kind of touch back to one thing that Talia had said about like laws not being self-effectuating. And so we really took that to heart, because we had, in kind of figuring out when we were going for confidentiality legislation specifically, we kind of surveyed all the different laws in Oregon around restorative justice. And we have found some laws that created restorative justice programs that none of us had ever heard of. And I remember chasing kind of a lead on one of them and learning that it was kind of what we expected. There was a statute that created a program, and that program did not exist because there were not the funds or the work that has been done to actually make that law meaningful. And so we wanted to, because we had limited time, none of us actually do kind of like lobbying or legislative work full time. Of course, we want to make sure that your time is spent in a meaningful way. And so we've really focused on, when we go to the legislature, it's almost always for funding. And then in 2023, we went for confidentiality, and that was really important because confidentiality legislation essentially it gave important protections to the programs that were associated with district attorneys' offices and with police departments, but it also created the opportunity to be able to do a restorative process with individuals without a district attorney or any other law enforcement having to sanction it first. And so though confidentiality doesn't preclude a district attorney from filing charges or investigating a crime, what it means is that you can safely have a restorative justice process without worrying that those statements of accountability and admissions that are made during that process could be used in a later court hearing. And so what that meant is that all of these programs that were developing across the state who are having mixed abilities to get referrals from their respective system partners now have the ability to partner directly with community-based organizations or just directly with individuals who are seeking restorative processes. And so in terms of that implementation, I think that's just going to be a really long ongoing process to provide education and to build out those partnerships. And I feel really good about it and how things have started. And a lot of the programs across the state are starting to kind of expand their referral network as a result. And so that's kind of how confidentiality assisted in the implementation of kind of this bigger project of trying to build up the restorative justice resources across the state. We just recently completed the second round of grant applications. So we had that initial allocation in 2021. Those grants went out the door in 2022 after the period of time that it took to stand up the grant program. Then we had a lapse in funding in 2023. And I just have to speak to another really critical part of implementation, which is just the amazingly dedicated people that work at these programs. Our funding came out from underneath us in 2023. There was an end date in the middle of 2024 where we didn't know if we were going to have funding until basically the last minute. And yet everybody stuck with it and they stayed in these programs and they continued to build and they continued to advocate and have faith that we were going to figure something out, even though there was absolutely no guarantee of that. And so that I think that it's just the kind of people that restorative justice draws are really passionate about this work. And that has been a huge piece of being able to successfully implement these programs when there's instability in funding due to political cycles. And I'll leave it at that. Oh, and I'll pass it to Erica.
Yeah, I will be very brief. Yeah, I think the only thing I have to add, because I really feel like the challenges of implementation and the fact that laws are not self-actualizing has been really beautifully covered. I guess I just want to invite, we are facing the same exact challenges, right? Like, I mean, capacity, funding, all of it to do the implementation work, specifically around AB 60. And what I think is, something just to put into the space is the difference between, like surface level implementation work and deep implementation work, because implementation is this like beautiful opportunity to step into relationships, especially around restorative justice, and and really invite people into a paradigm shift, right? Like, we know that we have these deeply harmful narratives that are embedded in so many of us across this country and this world, that like people don't change, there are bad people and good people, like individualism, like narrative change happens at the level of experience, right? Not cognition. And so, I used to work in capital defense litigation, and that was what I did with my law degree before I transitioned into restorative justice. And when it became unconstitutional to sentence kids to LWOP, so life in prison without parole, there was just a slew of laws passed around kind of the right to parole hearings for kids who had been sentenced. And the states that did deep implementation work, where they sat in like in trainings around childhood development, like early trauma experiences, just like really sat and had the capacity and the time and the funding, right, to really invite people into experiential opportunities that they were invited into because of the change in the law, but what was built out around implementation made such a difference between the states where kids were actually getting paroled at those parole hearings and not getting paroled. And so like it's an opportunity to really like invite and build relationships and invite people into experiences and learning that can actually shift paradigms. And it's such a shame when there isn't the capacity to actually do that. And when implementation is just very surface level, it's like this law was passed, this is now your responsibility as far as, you know, enacting it or effectuating it. And so we are doing our best to get to do the deep narrative change, like paradigm shifting approach to implementation. And that takes a lot of resources. And so, yeah, just kind of sitting in that real tension. And I'll pass to you, Shannon, if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah. I think, you know, when I say that I'm grumpy about the work, part of that came many years ago when I did this. Like I sort of started from the assumption that restorative justice legislation is a good thing, right? And so I did this work that was focused on understanding, well, how does it get adopted and why? And then after I did that, I was like, well, now let me, you know, measure the impacts of it. And that was when I think things really took a turn for me, because I started to try to reach out to different states and find evidence of where those bills had resulted in different kinds of outcomes or impacts. And, you know, to give a specific example, I would find a state that said, we're establishing an office of restorative justice. And then I would like look on every web page and call everywhere, and I like couldn't find an office of restorative justice, just to give a really simple example. And so I quickly sort of, that was my aha moment or realization about the gap between our sort of idealistic view of what we think a law or policy is going to achieve for us and what it actually achieves, which I think, to be fair, is probably the same gap that happens for us in the criminalization of different kinds of behaviors. We sort of think that, oh, we'll just make a law about it and then people won't do that thing anymore. Or in this case, we'll make a law about it and then people will do that thing. They'll refer cases to restorative justice, or they'll, you know, sort of do this positive thing, and it doesn't work that way. So I think a lot has already been said about the importance of that deep implementation work early and throughout the process. I think one other thing that I would want to add is the importance of being strategic about what bills that we put our energy and resources and time into, and sort of distinguish. One step of that is distinguishing between ideological and actionable bills. And what I mean by ideological bills is we have many of them in Colorado that say things like the state legislature or the you know, whatever sort of department or system, the criminal system in the state of Colorado, shall consider restoration as the goal of the criminal legal process, things like that. I'm not citing the legislation very well. You can look it up in the directory. But, you know, these sort of idea that we can legislate an intention or a legitimization of something into state code, which I think there is can be some benefits of that in terms of building out like definitions or a reference point. But I have noticed that people, when they're just new into thinking about how to expand restorative justice access through law, might gravitate toward ideological sort of bills that don't have teeth. And what I would think of as teeth are sort of accountability structures in legislation that establish who's responsible for implementation, or that create a data reporting mechanism, or that allocate funding for a certain thing to happen. or some sort of structural element of how the thing is going to take place. I heard Representative Weiss say earlier, because there was so much money involved, people were really motivated to do it. And that's a real thing. Or because there's a certain person whose time has been allocated through legislation to do a thing, then that could make sure that it happens. The other thing that I want to say, I guess, about my grumpiness is just reflecting on even those bills in Colorado that have been implemented, whether they're having the scale of impact that we imagined that they would have on the relationship between communities and the legal system. And so I guess I just want to, I would feel remiss to not kind of invite us to think about, when we put forward legislation, what do we actually hope to achieve through that legislation? Is it just to create a program, or just to kind of like have 5 more people get restorative justice? Is it something bigger than that? And how will we know if we achieve it? And to give an example of that, in 2014, Colorado passed a bill, I think it was House Bill 1254, and it established a juvenile diversion pilot program across 4 judicial districts in the state of Colorado that would agree to implement a pre-file restorative justice diversion project, collect data, and basically over 5 years, these judicial districts did it. And by some metrics, it was really successful in that they ran the diversion programs, and that people who participated in those programs demonstrated the predictably high rates of satisfaction that we all know that they would demonstrate, and that the participants were documented as having 8% recidivism rates. Although it's compared to 12% recidivism for people going through other types of diversion programs, juvenile pre-file diversion programs, but still low recidivism rates. One of my colleagues and I did a study to look at the impact in those communities on juvenile delinquency filings in those judicial districts, and compared across the period of the pilot compared to other judicial districts in the state. The pilot districts had on average 3 fewer juvenile filings per year. And so that's not to say that that's a failure of a legislation or the fault. There are many things that could be happening. And I let Avery know I'm happy to send some resources that she can share out at the end of the talk that have if you're into academic publications, you can read the fuller pieces on some of the studies that I'm talking about. But I think it really just led me to question what we're hoping to accomplish through some of our legislative efforts, and how we'll know if it's reaching the scale that we might have imagined that it was reaching.
Thanks, Shannon. And I appreciate that folks who are listening in and joining with us have been putting questions into the Q&A. I've been letting people know that they're in there as opposed to answering them live. Some have been more directed, but I want to bring one up that to everyone to think about, which is, we have a question from Olivia Turner that says, as RJ gains traction, how can we ensure that its implementation doesn't reinforce existing racial and economic inequalities, specifically for BIPOC communities, low-income folks, and others who've been marginalized from the criminal justice system? I have many thoughts on this, but I'm going to turn it over to each of you to perhaps reflect on, or if you want to lean into this question of how we. I'm not even going to use certain words because of the way that I think I'd be already answering the question. So, anyone that wants to answer Olivia Turner's question that's in there.
I can kick us off. So I guess in my experience, in terms of kind of developing the fund, in terms of trying to get programs off the ground, there really wasn't anything that could be built into a piece of legislation to make this happen, to make sure that the system that we were creating, the offerings that we were establishing, were not replicating the same harms of the criminal system. And there is a risk of that, of course, for a lot of different reasons. But when the programs in Oregon started, most of them, their primary referral source was from the district attorney's office. And so one issue is making sure that the way that referrals are happening in a racially equitable way, and that that referral process isn't having ingrained in it the same issues that exist within our criminal system. The program that I work most closely with is a program in Multnomah County, where Portland sits, called the Restorative Roots Project. And we partnered with Erica's organization, Equal Justice USA, in terms of getting training and technical assistance. And EJUSA operates with a high degree of intentionality in regards to ending BIPOC criminalization. And so one of the kind of key factors that Erica and her team walked us through was making sure that we were looking at data from the district attorney's office to recognize where criminalization of BIPOC youth or transitional age youth is where we started, though we ended up opening it up to adults generally. But we tried to kind of shape our eligibility criteria around where we were seeing the highest disproportionality in terms of criminalization for people of color. And so we baked into our eligibility criteria these different identifiers. And that's part of the reason that we decided to focus on higher level crimes, on specifically violent crimes. Another reason for that is just the data around restorative justice showing its highest level of efficacy is with those higher level crime types. And I think another thing that is important for us to consider when it comes to making sure that there is equity within the restorative justice is also on the side of harmed parties, and recognizing that people of color are also disproportionately victimized, and how our systems address that level of victimization, and when this option is offered to a harmed party, and how to kind of satisfy the needs of the people who have been hurt. And another piece of it is recognizing that a lot of people of color who end up being harmed have a lot of distrust of the system and may not even report those cases. And so that's another reason that I think that community referral options is really important for creating processes for addressing harm for communities of color, because those may be the very communities that don't even want to pick up the phone and call the police in the first place. And that, particularly extends to Latinx populations or immigrant populations who may be concerned about their ability to stay in this country based on making a call about their own victimization. And so I think that, being intentional with how eligibility criteria is set when it comes to coordinating with the district attorney's office, and also finding ways to move towards a community referral process, and then doing outreach in impacted communities, and making sure that there are partnerships with relevant community-based organizations, and that people in those communities are just aware that this resource exists and know how to access it.
I'll be really brief, but I'll just add, I think it would be useful to consider whether legislating data collection and reporting requirements can help promote accountability mechanisms around racial disparities in restorative justice. I think that's easier said than done, because depending on what state or what system you're working in, the criminal legal system is very practiced at obscuring data that might be useful in making that determination. I know in Colorado, it's been difficult for us to make some assessments about racial disparities in restorative justice because, for instance, we don't have access to consistent data from police departments across the state about racial disparities in their arrest. So that then makes it difficult to compare onto other places. However, thinking about whether we can ask for data collection and then data reporting back to the legislature or to other key state offices could be one way to think about creating accountability, or at least transparency.
Happy for folks to also weigh in, also have other questions in the Q&A. So really kind of wherever we want to land.
Oh, Yeah, we can, mine is really fast. I was just gonna kind of throw some things in there. So much of what was said, I second, third, fourth, really ensuring that people can access restorative justice without payment. I know of programs where you have to pay to access it. That's obviously going to impact disadvantaged communities, who don't have, that option. Removing restrictions for prior criminal history or probationary status, really just like the fact that prior contact with a system that's racially disparate is going to undermine opportunities for restorative justice, is going to only enhance racial and ethnic disparities. Yeah, I wanted to offer those as well.
I can be pretty fast too. I was just going to say, I can tell you what we did, but I also don't know if it's totally possible to embed restorative practices within state agencies and expect them to not be somewhat racially biased and unjust. But we did our best. And I think one of the main things is that we avoided being prescriptive. So that the programs that would received, technical assistance and support and funding, we weren't going to tell them what to do and how to do it and who to do it for. We were just going to make sure that communities were able to create the programs that would meet their needs. We also embedded into our statute the requirements for the qualifications of the director. And also we did include some criteria around the grant process to try to address inequities in grant funding. But there are issues like in Minnesota, all state grants have to be using the reimbursement model, meaning that they have to spend the money before they can get reimbursed for it, which is really inequitable. And I'm not sure there's a way that I can get around that just for my grants that I created. So yeah, so like we definitely tried, and I think there are things that we did that are better than they could have been, but I also see the way that things are playing out in implementation, and I regret that there wasn't more that we could do.
I'm just cross-referencing here and also looking at our time. I appreciate that folks are jumping in and responding to some of the questions as well. I know there was a question about eligibility criteria, and I think Tristan, excuse me, you're responding to that. That's certainly something that's across the country and it's not uniform. So eligibility criteria, I think, come up for people in different jurisdictions. And I just want to flag that it's not in isolation to just to Oregon, and that it's fantastic, right, that there's greater transparency. That's not true everywhere, to Shannon's point about asking for data. There was a question from Philcia Jenkins about racial disparities in the system and removing criminal history to promote equality. And I think this is dovetailing with what you were raising, Erica. And so I don't know if you want to kind of tease out those possibilities a little bit more from an expungement standpoint, for example.
Yeah, I can do my best. So in terms of getting involved in the process, so we have historically built programs that actually are pre-charge. And so while there is an arrest charge that ultimately can get expunged, we haven't, there isn't a charge from, let's say, the district attorney's office. That has really shifted as we worked with more adult programs and built out more adult programming. It has been more challenging to get folks to agree to divert pre-charge. And so in those contexts, there generally has been a charge, though we have not stepped into building programs that are like post-plea or kind of deferred prosecution, where you make some admission that ultimately will mean that if you are unsuccessful, that admission is on the record and you move, directly to sentencing per se, or that's included in kind of what's contemplated by the admission. So for us, I mean, we kind of get involved from the ground level, and it's very, it looks like everyone else is frozen. Oh no, okay, no, you're just very still. Sorry, I've been having internet issues this entire time. Okay, okay, so So in terms of, yeah, engaging, I mean, for example, Restorative Arlington, a program out here in Arlington, Virginia, they do an expungement clinic. So, you know, I think every other month, like any case that's been through restorative justice, because sometimes expungement is an actual challenging process that you, if not always, it takes resources. So with any program that we help to develop, there tends to be a package that as soon as someone completes the restorative justice process, they are informed about kind of their rights around expungement. And then ideally, there's also assistance in ultimately getting whatever can be expunged legally in that situation, in that case, in that state, expunged. But in terms of really those early conversations, yeah, luckily we have been able to partner with system agencies that have really kind of part of their reason for stepping into this is their own acknowledgement of the harm of racial and ethnic disparities in criminal legal system contact that exists in their jurisdictions. And they want restorative justice to actually, you know, to really serve and center the needs of survivors and to address disparities and a BIPOC criminalization. And so there is a willingness to not apply those eligibility criteria around criminal history that you see often applied with other diversion programs. Ultimately, that first case, that process of criminal prosecution was unsuccessful, right? We have another case. Let's try something new. You know, let's not allow criminal history to undermine our efforts to aligned with our values of addressing the disparate impact, the harmful racist impact of our criminal legal system on communities of color across the country. So it's been the subject of conversation, engagement, negotiation, and ultimately, luckily in a lot of our programs, most of our programs, criminal history does not create a barrier to entry and opportunities for restorative processes.
Great, and maybe you could respond just by providing the information organizationally as a follow-up. I think that would be great. So I appreciate that there's more questions about studies, and I see Shannon's taking lead on responding to that, but we only have 2 minutes left in our time together. So my invitation to each of our panelists is to sort of, what do you want to leave folks with? Sort of what is your parting thought in the context of our big header around restorative justice and legislation? And I'm just going to go in the arc of how you all are sitting for me. And so Tristan, I'm going to ask you to start first. We actually can't hear you now.
Okay, great. Is this any different? Okay. So I think one thing that was really important for me is recognizing that there will be wins and there will be losses, and to really think of things in terms of like a long-term vision of what you want to see. And I think in the beginning, there were actually a lot of successes really early on. And when we hit our first roadblock and, you know, had our funding yanked out from underneath us, I was ready to say like, oh, everything's done. Like it's over. I was like so worried about it. And then just had to step back and got to be around all of the programs. I actually heard about it when I was at a conference. And it just made me realize that, you know, the restorative justice movement is much bigger than one legislative decision. And even when it comes to issues with district attorney's office and trying to get referrals, you know, focusing on the work that's being done and on the creative ways that we can support it, and recognizing that this is a many-year process in the making, and we all get to be a part of it, which is really exciting. And we're all here to support each other. And I will pass it to Rep. Feist.
Cool, thanks. Tristan, I was going to mention, I'm going to try to get your confidentiality legislation passed here in Minnesota this session. So yay. So yeah, I would just, you know, like we've talked about how having somebody on the inside, a champion who's really passionate about the legislation, like how important that is to success. And, you know, I came to the legislature not knowing much or really anything about restorative practices. And it was because of experts, youth justice advocates, people sharing their own personal experiences that I grew really passionate about the impact of restorative justice. And so, like you all have the power to like create your own champion. It's not about just getting lucky and like, oh, there's somebody who happened to like Pete Lee came into the legislature with all of that passion. You can create that passion. Oh, I had one other brilliant thought. Oh yeah, I just feel like I was a little bit of a downer about our situation here in Minnesota, and I don't like. I'm very excited about what the future holds. You know, we built something collaboratively. It's really complicated, and I was talking with somebody recently, and they said systems change takes like 3 to 5 years. And so we're not even close to that yet. Like we've done something that I hope will be earth shattering and like systems changing, and we've taken that first step, and I'm really excited for what the future holds. So thanks for letting me be part of this conversation with all of these inspiring folks. And I'll pass it to Shannon. You are to my right, so you can go.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, final thoughts. I think what I can add in addition to what everyone else is saying is just really, you know, as the data person, I think that we often underestimate the ways that we could be really intentional about what it is that we're expecting to change, and then see at some level through some sort of data or information whether that's happening. And knowing that information can help us to refine our efforts. And I think that we're doing that is one of the things that I am really proud of that we're doing in Colorado, is just being so reflective constantly about what is the impact of our efforts, what are the implementation gaps, looking at pieces of legislation that have been passed in the recent years or recent decades to see whether we think they're being impactful. So both formal and informal efforts to sort of evaluate the effects of those impacts, and then to adjust the way that we move going forward so that we're constantly sort of learning and growing.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll say is just, yeah, find out who around you is doing this work, you know, build relationship, build power, get together, you know, whether it is legislative advocacy or anything else, right? Like, yeah, building coalition is going to get us far. And so I really encourage that. And yeah, grateful to be on this panel and to be in this space with all of you.
Great. Thank you to each of our panelists. I really appreciate the time and dedication and care that you've brought to this conversation and to the work that you're doing out in the field. Thank you for everyone for joining us. I believe this conversation will be made available and archived, and I'm going to turn it over to Avery for any closeouts on behalf of the National Center.
I'll keep it short. Thank you so much. This was extremely insightful and helpful. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our moderator, Talia. I will go ahead, like Shannon said, I will send out the recording, but I'll include a link to the laws database, a link to the map, as well as any resources that you panelists would like to provide. That's all I have. Don't forget to fill out the feedback form. Keep those suggestive topics coming, and take care, folks.